Okay,
Might,
let me just go to,
there's probably enough just to talk about with Ukraine. If you want to skip YouTube, there's definitely some interesting things on COVID-19, but
well, I'm not skipping YouTube. I'm actually doing YouTube. So let's be careful.
so we just skip that for a week, whether you're not on COVID-19.
Or I can always X out of YouTube if we're going to get to beyond the sensibilities of our good friends at YouTube. But I want to run with YouTube for now. Let me just see here. All right. And of course, they call us, this is a live program, Monday through Friday, 10 till midnight, except on Friday, it's pre-recorded. And you can call in if you happen to be listening, 617-396-4958, 617-396-4958. And we have chat on Rumble. Rumble is sort of the flagship, if you will. And you can go to Rumble on Rumble. Whoops, there we go. We're getting a little echo here. You'll have to excuse me. There it is. Yeah, check it out on Rumble. Charles Moskowitz on Rumble. So, David, I see you have a new camera. You've got a new computer. You look much more professional. You're really starting to come up in the world. What's going on?
Yeah, thank God. Just you mentioned Rumble. I saw that, I used to stream with Lo Gallon in Jerusalem, who, worked with Roseanne Barr and had Root and Branch. And he became a little bit of a COVID-19 conspiracist. So he's not on YouTube at all anymore. And he switched to Rumbles, but he's teamed up with this Dr. Zev Zelenko.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So he's getting thousands of views now. Like, so his regular program is only getting tens of views, but he's got like a weekly program with Zev Zelenko, and it's getting thousands, even broken tens of thousands, over 10,000 views on Rumble.
Well, I mean, we should save that for Rumble. I mean, we can discuss it sort of euphemistically on YouTube, but yeah, Zelenko is
just
huge.
mentioned that I mean, he completely is off YouTube, and
Yeah,
he's on
I understand.
Rumble, and having Zelenko is a big name relatively, and that's been able to garner him. He's got 1,000 subs, and he's getting the Zelenko shows get multiple thousands of views on Rumble.
Okay. You know what? I think I'm going to shut down YouTube because we should talk about this. Just for my YouTube listeners, we can't discuss this in YouTube because it's censored. But if you want to hear the entire interview, go to the program on Rumble or go to charlesmoskowitz.com and you can hear the program in its entirety. But for now, adios to YouTube.
Okay, great. Yeah, I wanted to discuss also, God forbid, this new conspiracy theory. I'm gonna have to go to my old computer. I'm just walking around my house so I could share the video.
Okay.
But yeah, are you off of YouTube?
Yes.
So I saw, Kevin Barrett. I'm not sure if you spoke with him, but we had mentioned trying to book him. I haven't spoke with him for over a year. The guy who's on Iranian TV, the convert to Islam. And
Yes,
he had Ron Unz on his channel from the Unz Report, and it was kind of viral in his claim on the origins of COVID-19. So before we get to Ukraine, do you want to discuss?
Yes, let's talk about that because, we've had, you and I actually together had Kevin Barrett on. I actually just listened to an interview that Kevin Barrett did with E. Michael Jones on his station. And, he's got some interesting things. He's getting very good. He's kind of humorous. I mean, I actually agree with like a lot of what he has to say, except of course, when they start to delve into the Jewish issue, which they go kind of off the deep end on that one. And E. Michael Jones made a comment that really is, I don't know, he's really starting to go off, as they might say in Hasidic circles, he's going off the derrick. In that he
they're both regulars on press TV, Iranian TV. So
Yes,
you're like,
well, that says a lot.
they're not off the derrick. I'm saying they've been regulars on press TV
They're not off the
for
derrick in that
for
sense, but
maybe a decade. I'm saying they wouldn't be regulars on
oh
press
yeah, but I
TV.
mean, I've followed Michael Jones. You know, I've had him on many times, and he's
I
now
mean, he's been a regular on press TV for a decade.
I know, but now he's sort of bordering in the waters of Holocaust denial. I mean, I've heard a few things, but one comment that he made that particularly troubled me was that he said that the Holocaust basically was made up in 1948 as a way to justify the creation of the state of Israel. In other words, he's blaming specifically Zionists for the development of the Holocaust, more broadly Jews, and that it never happened. I mean, I wouldn't say he's saying it's never happened, but he's into this idea that it was exploited and even like exaggerated to try to help the state of Israel. And that, I mean, I don't know. I mean, that really bugs me. I don't know if I really want to have him on my show. And the last time I asked him if he'd like to come on with me, he kind of bowed out because I think that he doesn't want to talk about this with me. But anyway, getting back to the subject of Kevin Barrett and the and COVID, what are they working on, and what is Zelenko saying?
Okay, well, I was just mentioning Zelenko. He's probably not an expert on it. Just because he's on this Low Gallon show and it's getting these huge numbers on Rumble. So
Yeah.
it's Ron Unz, who I guess is also Jewish, of for the Unz report, who self-funded. I guess he was an extremely intelligent person who made a lot of money in physics and computer company, and he's got I think it's one of the top 10 biggest news blogs, even though it's highly censored, and hosts God forbid, extreme anti-Semitic content, even though Unz himself is, I believe, 100% Jewish, actually Ukrainian Jewish. But so he's been following, I mean, he's had a similar statements about COVID-19 that he says his claim, that it was clearly a bioweapon, and his claim is gotten more in detail, and so he's saying that, I mean, he said similar things, and now he's given more names and details, that it was a U.S. bioweapon that basically backfired, that the U.S. created COVID-19 in order to release it on China and Iran. And he says that it was Pompeo and Bolton who did it, that without Trump's knowledge, that it was the Trump administration without Trump's knowledge, and it was kind of a rogue Pompeo Bolton plan to attack Iran and China. And
but it ended up backfiring, or it just went all over the world?
yeah, they say it was backfired. That means if you historically that it hit China first and then Iran, and so that's more, I guess. There's not necessarily strong evidence, but I mean, just said that, like, how is it possible that one of the first places hit was specifically the Iranian parliament? And so that's one of his strongest evidence. I don't know if he has more evidence, but I was mentioning last week on YouTube the possibility, saying that America has really decreased in our international power over the last 2 years, and especially when we start talking about Ukraine and what we could have done about it. But the possibility that it was a bioweapon by China, although the research, even Rand Paul is saying that if it was gain of function research in the Wuhan lab, that was our research, that was U.S. research signed off by Dr. Fauci.
That's
and
right.
actually releasing it, whether it was purposely released as a mistake, released by the U.S. to try to attack Iran and China, and then backfired. And then there's other elements that are scientifically more questionable, whether, like, I guess it binds to this ACE2 receptor, and the claim that like it would have been a bioweapon created by China, God forbid, is that the ACE2 receptor is something that's more common in Europeans. And so we're seeing that America and the US and possibly India, that could also be like an enemy of China, that has genetic similarities, that these ACE2 receptors are actually significantly more common. So the reason it hasn't caught on in Africa or China or some of these other nations is because a genetic factor that it was purposely created to affect Europeans worsely. So there's
Mhm.
conflicting conspiracy theories of the bioweapon, but I mean, it's taking that it wasn't a lab leak mistake. It was purposely created and it was purposely released. So Ron Unz is saying that it was us who did it. It was, in fact, it was the Trump administration, although he says it was Bolton and Pompeo uh, who did it without the knowledge, without Trump knowing about it, as some basically to attack Iran and
Okay.
China, and God forbid it backfired. And then there's the other conspiracy theory that, because Trump was trying to get too tough on China, that China purposely did it, and
Mhm.
China may have purposely let it get out in their area because they figured China has better technique to be able to beat the virus, so that China purposely let it grow in their territory in order that would be large enough to spread, knowing that the West and
Was
the
vulnerable.
implications, if it was a bioweapon, um, is is it still coming? Like, is it possible that
Well, sure. Could be worse.
Amarcan was also created in a lab, and that COVID was almost over, the vaccine was working, and they released another one, and in that case, that like they could keep releasing them. So there's
They
just
could.
some of the conspiracy theories that are unknown, and so Unz is saying it was an economic, because God forbid, like a bioweapon that would kill large amounts of people. This only kills like 1 out of 1,000 people who get it, and so that it's meant to long term slow the economy and have long, like, so like it's not like a
Right.
God forbid a deadly bioweapon
No,
like
but it caused the
anthrax.
economy to shut down. I mean, look, David, I did, when I first got involved with doing talk radio, back like in 2000, 2001, that long ago, I was on the American Freedom Network in Colorado. I used to call in from Boston.
Ron
And
might come onto your show. It's possible. I don't have his contact, but I wouldn't be surprised if you could get him on your show.
I'd like to. I'd like to. So tell him I'd like to have him on.
I don't have any contact with
But
him.
all
Maybe
right. I
Kevin
mean, I could
Barrett or
look into
something.
it. I'll look into it. But the thing is that I remember even back then people were talking about biological weapons. I don't think that was a big secret. That was written about in the Globe. I mean, that we're advancing in biological weapons. George H.W. Bush talked about it publicly, and that Fort Detrick in Maryland was the center for creating biological technologies in terms of weapons. Russia, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was talk about the Marlin biological weapon that they had and what they were going to do with it. So this is no big secret. This is something that's been out there for a long time. As far as whether or not the particular coronavirus that we're now dealing with is a biologically enhanced virus that came out of the Wuhan lab, I think that's something that a pretty good number of scientists now believe it was. In earlier this year, international scientists visited the Wuhan lab. They were denied access to certain things, but they all came to the conclusion that the virus was created in that lab. And the result was that the New York Times and the media, the establishment media, were forced to cover this, and they were forced to say this. And I think at this point, I wouldn't say common knowledge, but it is fairly accepted. I even think I could probably get away with saying this on YouTube, that the coronavirus is created in a laboratory, and that as such, it's a biological weapon, whether it was released on purpose or by accident. I don't even think it matters. But the point is, it was released and it was created in China, and that it was given assistance and financing by people like Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, and several other doctors.
But
And
Unz is pointing his fingers at Pompeo and Bolton.
I have no idea about that. That's
I mean,
a
like I
sheer.
said, okay, like the NIH and Fauci, they're just doctors. They're not going to release a
No,
bioweapon.
but they're
So
very
that's a
political
military
doctors.
thing.
They're
Saying
very,
Pompeo
yeah,
was
but they're very political people. And Fauci has his hand, according to Robert F. Kennedy, and you really have to see his speech. It's tremendous, by the
Well, I
way.
mean, he's the doctor who developed it, but I was saying like he wouldn't have. He's not a military guy. So I was saying like I mean, the Unz is
No, I don't
saying,
think he
and he's
released it,
saying
but he
Bolton or
promoted.
Pompeo.
Look, could be. I have no idea. I don't know why. I'd have to see where he came up with that. But the point is that Senator Rand Paul, when he interviewed Fauci, he pointed out that Fauci was lying about this and that he had his hands fingerprints were all over it. And we need to know this because if we can if we can find out, we can at least begin to stop this from happening in the future. And that, yeah, as you said, they might release another one that could be a lot worse. They could release one that could wipe out a quarter of the population of the planet, that would make the coronavirus look like nothing.
And that the like MERS, and they've even claimed that they have MERS, which I think is the camel one that was in Saudi Arabia a few years ago that, God forbid, has like a 1 out of 4 death rate or 1 out of 2 death
That's
rate.
right. It could wipe out a quarter of the population of the entire Earth. And the thing is that in order to control this, you have to get people like Fauci and them to admit that this was the case so that we can then get to China and find out what the DNA sequence of these things are so we can develop a vaccine that actually works and that can actually give immunity, unlike the vaccine that they have now, which is not too good. I mean, it's not perfect. I'm not saying don't take it. I have had it, but they can't really get to the bottom of the exact formula because they need that information from the lab. But in order to get that information, people like Fauci are going to have to admit that they help finance it. And he won't do that because if he does, he's going to go to jail for a long time because
it's very possible they have the more deadly ones and they're just sitting on them.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason they released them, that they have the more deadly ones that they hope they don't have to release. Like even if the Chinese, God forbid, purposely did it, that they're not that vicious that they want to kill that many people. But if they did do it like that, they're probably sitting on more deadly ones that they could release at any time.
Exactly.
Or if you're conspiratorial about the U.S. government doing it to us, our own citizens, the U.S. government is also probably very likely.
Very, very possible.
I mean, it's pretty. I'm not a scared type. Like I don't even necessarily fear death like that. So I wouldn't say it's a scary thing to think about. But
well, it is.
It requires to be thought about, because it's just how do we deal with this and the likelihood that it was a weapon. And then saying, well, who did it? God forbid, millions of people have been killed. And then let alone, how do you stop it from happening in the future? And whoever did it likely could keep on doing it.
Well, the way to stop it, as Rand Paul said in his testimony, is that we have to get it on the record that this is exactly what's happened. It has to be admitted by the people who were involved, like Fauci. And then China has to be pressured, maybe even with a war, to release their information about this so we can develop a vaccine to counter it. We can't do that unless we have the actual formula of how this was created in the lab. And otherwise we're just guessing. And then, yeah, it is a very big possibility. And there's nothing you and I can do about it, except for we can try to protect ourselves by improving our immune system, by trying to be healthy, and by not in a way succumbing to these mandates and these lockdowns and these passports and these masks that really haven't done anything to stop it. We have to not let that happen again. So if another virus suddenly appears, let's say before another election, so they can send out tens of millions of unsolicited ballots. And by the way, David, your state of Michigan, apparently I saw something in the news recently that the corrupt government there published 7 million ballots for the last election. Nobody knows where they went. Nobody knows who got them. But
I got like 3 in the mail. I mean, I didn't even vote.
Did you?
Like three different times I got a ballot in the mail, maybe only twice.
Yeah, I rest my case. I mean, in the case of the Maricopa County audit, they found some people got 50 in the mail. I mean, they
I didn't even request one, but
no,
yeah, I mean,
even in Massachusetts,
then they just sent me a ballot. It was like vote.
Yeah, and you're getting. I mean, in Massachusetts, they even did this, and they just were mailing. I mean, the point is that that kind of thing happened because of the alleged emergency of the coronavirus. That was what
like even during COVID-19, like I had to chase the people away from my door. God forbid, knocking on the door, like
with ballots.
Like, are you going to vote? Are you registered? Why not? And they had special provisions, like even because in my neighborhood you're not allowed to. You have to get a license to go door to door.
Yeah,
so they even have like special provisions to go door to door.
It's illegal. It's illegal. And they were doing what's
I mean, it
called
was
ballot
within the
harvesting.
legality of the state that the state was allowed to, trump the local law in order to do that, like they did on behalf
Well,
of the
they
state.
did it again because your corrupt Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, did this by fiat by simply ordering that it be done without any legislative input, which is not lawful because the state legislature, Article 2 of the Constitution, holds the sole power to regulate elections, not the secretaries of state. She was put in there, like a lot of these other corrupt secretaries of states, by left-wingers like George Soros and the Southern Poverty Law Center, as you've pointed out to me, David, so that they could
Directory, and she was on the being board of directors and funded by Mark Zuckerberg largely.
Zuckerberg, who put out $420 million out of his own pocket for walk-around money so that they could pay these harvesters, the people who were banging on your door to get you to vote. They were harvesting ballots. They were going into nursing homes, for example, and filling out ballots for people who were in stages of dementia or even who had died, and putting them all in these satchels. Dinesh D'Souza also has a new movie coming out called 3,000 Mules, where he has footage. The whole movie is nothing but footage. I haven't seen it yet, but I've seen the trailer and I heard him talk about it, of people going to these drop boxes and stuffing them with ballots in the middle of the night. Now, the drop boxes, you're only supposed to put in one ballot, and you are supposed to, that the person that puts the ballot in is either the person who's voting or one person that they designate for them because they can't get out because they might not be healthy. You're not supposed to show up with a whole backpack filled with ballots. And these videos, they show them people like they're stuffing. They got gloves, they've got gloves on, and they're stuffing those boxes. I mean, this is this is old-fashioned ballot stuffing, and they were paid. There's already one person that stepped forward and testified to this in Atlanta. So that's what happens when there's a coronavirus scare or some other kind of scare. And what I'm suggesting is that these things are scary, but if you're listening to this program, you have to take personal responsibility and protect yourself by doing a little stockpiling on food and water. Get some of these food kits that can last for 25 years. I see.
My parents are about to get solar power. They already got a generator installed.
Yeah.
And they're going to get solar power too. I mean, the generator is still dependent upon natural gas and the grid, so you get solar power also.
That's right. Solar power, battery power. What extra water stockpiled, extra food. Be prepared. I mean, that's one of the good things. Well, not that there's anything good, but one of the positive byproducts of this recent scare is that people have learned how to do that. They prepped. It's called prepping. People used to laugh at people who did this. But now it's turned out that every citizen should do it. It's like we're back in the old days of the Wild West frontier. You have to have self-sufficiency. You need to learn how to survive alone. You learn how to get by, and also improve your immune system by things like vitamin C, D3, and zinc, and by just losing a little weight, frankly, like I needed to do and have done, and exercise and getting healthy. That's how you're going to fight the virus. And take precautions. If you have a pre-existing condition, if you're over 70 years old, wear the mask. Don't go into crowds. Use antiseptics. Fine. These things there's nothing wrong with that. I'm only noting it because we ought to understand that we cannot let the government do this again, in terms of literally using this as an excuse to shut down our economy, to shut down our children at school, to shut down our ability to go outside even and to function. And we can't be that frightened. I mean, you probably know people like this, David, that they were so frightened during this pandemic that they're there with the double masks. They're walking down the street with a mask on, and if they see somebody coming, they go to the other side of the street and they're washing and they get groceries. So they go home and they take their clothes off and put them in a plastic bag and take a shower. And then they wash every piece of a grocery item with antiseptic. I mean, it got to be that bad. Some people are that frightened. We have to
I'm a science guy, so I'm pretty cautious. Like I wear my mask, I hand sanitize.
Sure, as do
But
I,
like, I
but
know how you catch viruses. I mean, you don't magically catch
yeah.
viruses. You largely catch it from people or from, snot that would be left somewhere. So, doing overkill on things that just don't help.
Well, that's
I
right. You
mean,
take
thank God
reasonable
it's been 2 years
precautions
now. I didn't get the vaccination and I didn't
and you
catch
haven't
it.
had the virus.
Although I stopped going to synagogue, I stopped going to events,
Mhm.
and so I took a lot of precautions that, but yeah, I still go to the grocery store
Yeah,
and things. I wear my mask. I hand sanitize. I'm very careful not to touch things like, I have my tzitzis that I use to open and close doors. And like I
sure.
said, I was doing that before COVID-19 also. Like I was always using like my code handle to open and close doors. I always avoided public restrooms unless I absolutely had to, or I was a hand washing almost compulsive about it. But
Right.
yeah, people got to take our lives into our own hands,
That's
and
right.
the
You have to
government,
use,
you can't rely on the government to do something that's really going to benefit. It's going to be people's own personal responsibility that will get ourselves through it.
you have to, exactly, you have to assess reasonable precaution and risk. I mean, I tend to be like that too. I mean, I don't like crowds and I do try to protect myself. But, at the same time, you've got to get out and live and you have to take reasonable risks to do normal things in the course of a day.
I
And the
pivoted to
government,
eBay also. Like I saw this was likely, and so I pivoted so that I would be likely to, have an eBay business. And thank God I've been able to sustain myself,
Mhm.
basically isolated with an eBay business.
What is your eBay business?
Um,
You sell
I
books,
just
right?
have Duvid, yeah. I mean, on eBay, mostly books, CDs. I'm getting another lot of CDs and books, CDs, DVDs, collectibles.
Mhm.
Um, just get by mostly through my father who does hospice, who buys collections. Actually, if you want, I'll show you something interesting. You might get a kick out of these, and
Yeah,
they're actually valuable. So if you want to talk for a second, I'll show you something
sure.
kind of cool that's valuable.
Oh, okay. No, I mean, in a way, one of the other aspects of the coronavirus that I think is positive and is that people have learned how to do e-commerce and do businesses at home. I mean, in my case, I write books and I now am writing pamphlets. And I have a whole pamphlet series and I make them available through Amazon. So, okay, what is this?
We're going to talk about the war in Ukraine, but my dad does hospice, and he buys things off some of his patients. And so these are old. Some of these are old, some of them are newer. And these are military books. There's a company called Squadron Signal. They also make
Mhm.
these model tanks, and it has
Okay,
tanks, battleships, airplanes. These are newer ones.
that's cool.
I have some vintage ones, like World War II
Mhm.
magazines, and
Yep.
a lot of them just go over. I'm selling these old watch and clock magazines. Here's one's Italian battleships of World War II, the rise of the ironclads. Here's one,
That was
the
Civil War.
USS Lexington, the
Mhm.
USS Los Angeles, the USS Cassin Wood. Um, these are small publishers, Warship Pictorial. Here's one, German battleships,
Mhm.
1939 through 45. I actually have like 100 of them. And
Wow.
these are, some of these are worth $10, $20 each. So, like, God forbid, like I don't know how much your book would be going for if it was being sold used on eBay, but books go close to nothing. But so these are actually more valuable than books.
Right.
And I have a lot of books up for sale, like CDs, classical music, just whatever you mean, just buy and sell. There's a famous quote in the Talmud where the businessman speaks to the rabbi and says, the rabbi says, "I do exactly what you do. I buy low and sell high, and I do good deeds in this world that are very easy and collect the world, the reward in the world to come. But it's just buy low and sell high, wherever you find things that you could buy in a lot for cheaper. Baseball cards, comic books, records. Like I'm probably going to be moving into records, which vinyl, which are actually very valuable, and some
Really.
even collectibles. I don't know if you were
Well,
like a
because it's, no,
Frank Zappa
I
fan,
still have some old vinyl from the old days, and
sitting
also,
on like some Frank Zappas and turn out to
yeah,
be
Mothers of Invention.
valuable.
You bet.
Certain ones, like, I mean, most collections. I mean, there's an art of buying things that are valuable because everyone has collections of books and
Yes.
baseball cards, and most of them are worthless. But within a lot, and then it's something like this where someone could be sitting on these World War II books that are
Mm.
actually maybe even worth a few $1,000s in totality or a good few $100. But you could be sitting on ones that are worth nothing. So just a
Well, a
good
lot of
eye.
it has to do with, I mean, it's an issue of scarcity, it's supply and demand. I mean, obviously, with the case of vinyl, they're not making it anymore. So it's, and people, and they're going away, they get destroyed, they wear out. So if you have good vinyl, it does become valuable. It's like baseball cards, right? If you have a Mickey Mantle from 1958, that could be worth $1 million because it was a rare, I mean, they were issued very limited issue. And, it's already almost, 50, 60, 70 years old at this point. So there's probably very few left. And so therefore, the scarcity of it gives it value.
You
I
have to
mean,
have some way to, you could buy lots and closeouts, like all types of Jews do closeouts. My dad specifically is a family doctor and does house calls and hospice
right.
and largely, buys things off of patients. A lot of these things get tossed and a lot of these things are near impossible. So even if you knew its value, uh, it's very difficult to get a price. I mean, if you had like a Mickey Mantle or something, but like, okay, even if these books are worth $10 each, okay, I have a eBay, with over 2,000 positive reviews on, like a 99.8% sellers rating and then one negative review. So even if you wanted to sell them, um, if you took him to a dealer, he'd probably give you $50, $100 for the whole lot, as opposed if you had a good, page, you might be able to make $500,000. So, that's working out pretty good. And as long as my dad keeps on, he's 70, 71 now.
Mhm.
But he keeps on working, he keeps on doing house calls and hospice and just buy stuff off of his patients. He sees things, and usually they're very happy to, a lot of this, most of them are really, throwing stuff out, or their kids don't even want it. And so, turn it into a good business.
Good. Well, I mean, I think
But
that a
we
lot of
looked at
people,
that a few years ago when, COVID-19 was hitting. I was like, yeah, it's probably a good idea. And the reality is my dad keeps most of it. Like he just
Mhm.
gives me the stuff he's kind of a collector. So he just gives me the stuff he doesn't even want. So I help him out
No, I
and do
mean,
the
it,
boxes and
it,
organize, and he gives me the stuff he doesn't want. And,
it's a
and that's
business that's
enough to have a
taken,
business.
it's taken off during the pandemic because people are doing more online e-commerce.
I
So,
wouldn't have done it. It was saying like before the pandemic, I wouldn't even have done it. Like it
right.
wouldn't have been interesting enough. Like who wants to flip through a bunch of old, books and old stuff from like God forbid, hospice patients or something. But yeah, I mean, COVID-19 and isolation, just sifting through old boxes of stuff and trying, to pick out valuable stuff is turned into something more interesting and a good part, good parnassa, thank God.
Hmm. Excellent. And this, I think that the issue of the pandemic itself, um, maybe this is just a theory on my part, but the um, the Canadian government almost went into like a state of emergency over the trucker protest, and I think that I found that to be very strange because all they had to do and all the prime minister had to do was go out and give them a little bit of respect and meet them and ask them what were their grievances. And their grievances were pretty simple. They simply were against the vaccine passport. I don't think much else. I mean, eventually it expanded a little bit into all of the mandates, but this wasn't something that's all that radical. And yet the Prime Minister of Canada, who was happy to meet with Black Lives Matter, not only refused to meet them, but he attacked them and smeared them and really made horrendous references to them. And that gets into the fact that this,
Could just be the
un-
beginning to them, God forbid. So it could likely be like January 6th, where for like years, they're going to be arresting people
yeah,
and bringing lawsuits you know, deplatforming them and taking away bank
taking the
accounts. God
money
forbid,
and
it looks like that. I mean, as of now, it
euthanizing
looks
their
like that.
pets. I mean, it's horrible. And look, the
It's not
bottom,
surprising. I mean, it really is horrible, but like, God forbid, it's really not surprising either.
well, it's not surprising because the fact is that the truckers represent, unlike, like the kind of the,
A threat to the system, a threat to what they're
well,
trying
that's
to
right.
do.
Unlike, Occupy Wall Street or unlike BLM, which are kind of phony, top-down, financed turf movements, that then basically at their core, you have a lot of, kind of like spoiled college kids, who go out and they're looking for some adventure. The truckers are actually, that's a real workers movement. I mean, these are real people who, literally work for a living and who keep the lines of distribution open for all of us. And they have real grievances, and that is a movement that is resonating all around the world. You have people in Australia, New Zealand, France, I think even now Israel. So, this is something that is a threat to this kind of establishment, and Trudeau represents that in a big way. I mean, he's very much a product of the Davos, World Economic Forum. In fact, I think he attended their training, as did this vice premier in Canada. What's her name? I forget her name now. Freeland. Um, and that these people, they don't want to have an actual workers movement. But I do think that the truckers movement is responsible for getting rid of the mandates now, because I don't know if we ever would have gotten rid of them without them. And even here in Massachusetts now, they are getting rid of it. In my state, they tend to do things on a city and town basis. That's why they say that Massachusetts is a commonwealth as opposed to a state, because the cities and towns have a lot of power. So if you go to one town, they have no masks. If you go to another town, they have double masks. It depends on which town you're in. But the point is that they are getting rid of it across the country because it's not popular, because the Democratic Party is going right into is going the way of the dodo bird unless they get rid of it, because most Americans, including liberals, don't want it anymore, and because the virus is over. So, but I don't think they would have gotten rid of it had it not been for the truckers. I think the truckers gave it that little extra push, because when Trudeau came out with all those lies, oh, they're Nazis, these are Hitlers, nobody believed it. It didn't really work. And it turned out that their movement was popular with about 60%, 70% of the population. So once they saw that, they realized that the whole mandate thing is over. However, I will just say a caveat to that, and that is that Biden very quietly has renewed the emergency, didn't do it publicly. This is according to the Gateway Pundit. And that even though Canada now has ended the emergency, they have left in place the ability to reactivate it at any time. And so we might have a sense of false security thinking that these mandates are over, but they're not over. They're still there. There's just a situational thing. They're going to ease them up a little here, but they'll put them back another time when they need to. And they're
So we don't
not,
even know the origins of COVID-19. I mean, it could be a bioweapon, there could be more coming.
yeah,
And,
that's
most of
right.
the experts have said 4 years to end the pandemic, where we got another 2 years, and really till 90% of the whole world is vaccinated. I mean, at least according to the mainstream narrative, that until 90% of all of the world is vaccinated, there's going to keep on being
Yeah.
outbreaks and variants. And even if the U.S. was 100% vaccinated, that until the majority of the world is vaccinated, that there'll keep on being new variants
Oh,
and
we'll
slow
never be ready.
outbreaks. So they said another 2 years, that God willing, there's not. I mean, there could be next year just as bad of an outbreak. It could be in a few months. There'll be another outbreak, but minimally over the next 2 years, you would expect that there'll be small outbreaks, at least in areas, and it'll be likely people will have to wear masks, and and there could even be surges of deaths. And at this point, Democrat, Republican, everyone wants this thing over, but it's not going to be over. And in terms of like the totalitarianism, I mean, they're not really interested in like, forcing vaccines and vaccine passport. They're interested in the state power that came with it.
Well, that's
And they
right.
don't want to relinquish that, even if they're, give a little, leeway on mandatory vaccines or passports. But in terms of the governmental control over people, that's what they're not going to relinquish.
Well, that's exactly right. That's what I'm saying. Even if it does, even if it appears to go away, they have still taken this power to conduct this kind of medical fascism. Under the guise of an emergency, they can reactivate it anytime they want. And they're not going to let that go away at all. Maybe they'll wait till after the election, which is, by the way, why it is very important that Republicans, I think, win, because otherwise we're not going to have any hope at all. And they
And there's certain trends like the fact that African Americans are the most hesitant to get the vaccine, and is the biggest Democratic constituency. So as elections come,
oh
and the
yeah,
Democratic Party needs, African Americans basically is their single largest constituency,
and they're losing
they're
them,
the-
and they're losing them big time.
specifically over the vaccine.
And a lot of things. I think that recent polls, in fact, a recent Quinnipiac poll, which is not a right-wing poll. I mean, this is a Quinnipiac College in Connecticut is very liberal. They showed that I think it's something like 28 to 30% of blacks are voting Republican. That's huge. About 40% of Hispanics.
But even if they just have low voter turnout, be enough to have, at least let the Republicans likely take over the House and Senate. You don't even need large amounts of blacks to vote
But they're
Republican.
they're actually energized.
But I was saying just low voter turnout is enough to flip the
Right.
House and Senate.
But I think that they actually tend to come out, and there's a good deal of energized momentum. What do you think, David, about the biggest story, of course, right now in the world, which is Russia's full bore invasion of Ukraine? It does look like we don't know what's going on. It's the fog of war right now, but it does appear that they have taken the airport in Kiev. It does appear that they are advancing on 3 fronts: out of Belarus, out of the east, of the Donbass region, and out of the south, out of Crimea. And, it just looks like all out war. We don't know what's going to happen. I hope that whatever happens, I hope it happens quickly so there's not too much loss of innocent life or any life.
I read up on it all day today and
Yeah.
yesterday. And, I was watching the news also. There was not much good information on the news. I actually was on the Ralph stream in London the last few days, also discussing with some Europeans. Yeah, I mean, last week I was skeptical that there would be an invasion, but there was, and it happened. It's ironic. I was listening to Putin, and it's like he was, giving your exact, they would say like your Hezbollah talking points for Israel, for his explanation of, saying like it's a defensive war, and if you're looking that, Russia is from a certain perspective defending against Western incursion and threats to that they're largely taking over. I mean, there's 2 aspects. There's the territory where there's supposed where there's an ethnic Russian majority, and that is likely to be annexed. That was likely the cause of the whole conflict in the beginning, was to annex these parts. And then that the point that Putin claiming in a defensive way is largely taking over the military sites and that have been created by NATO, and that Putin claims were basically for the whole only purpose of being an existential threat to Russia. A lot of people think Ukraine, like kind of like the Palestinians, is not really Ukraine. It was a failed state. It was a puppet state. NATO was just propping it up in order to.
Well, first of all, I mean, Ukraine is not actually a member of NATO, but I
Well, I'm
think
saying
that
it's not even a real state in the first place. If you say, kind of like there's no Palestinian people, that from the Russian side you give like the extreme. Uh, yeah, I want to mention a few things related to it. Like, I mean, God forbid, there's been bloodshed, but so Putin has offered amnesty to Ukrainian soldiers that surrender. There, it hasn't happened yet. I mean, but the possibility that it doesn't look like the cavalry's not coming. NATO in Europe, they're not sending troops.
Oh, no.
The
That's okay.
sanctions are unlikely, so it's extremely likely that by the end of the week, Russia will basically have taken over all of the key military sites of the Ukraine. And then you see that if Russia wants to, basically take over all of the Ukraine, they probably could. I mean, depending on the will of the Ukrainians. I mean, there's a lot of weaponry in Ukraine, and the President Zelensky was, just say they're handing out guns. They even say a martial law. Some people even claim he wants to like enforce some sort of mandatory induction to fight. But it's unclear how much appetite there's going to be for Ukrainians to resist, and certainly in certain territories, if there's some sort of mass surrender or switching to the Ukraine. So the Israeli
Right.
perspective is interesting because I mean, Israel, like, I mean, we'll discuss also. I'll just mention now some of the points, like the Putin's claiming that he's denazifying Ukraine, kind of like I said, like to save
Oh,
the
yeah, yeah.
Jews, the narrative, like, Russia's the good guys because World War II, they saved the Jews and defeated the Nazis. And, so Israel's role is a minor weapons dealer, minorly trying to prop up, the state of Ukraine. And this complaint about arming neo-Nazis or certain elements, it's been around for years. And actually, it's been a complaint against Israel because Israel's been one of the bodies that has been helping train Ukrainian troops and sell weaponry to them, although it's rather minor. So in Israel, the left, like Lapid, I think, I'm not sure if Gantz, but have denounced Russia. Bennett today chose not to denounce Russia. He spoke up in defense of the Ukrainian people, but he didn't denounce Russia. And it kind of goes back to the arguments I had with you over the last few weeks about kind of like the old Republican neocon American talking point about Israel spreading democracy or the Abraham Accords, and saying that it's unclear that you could say that like we've talked about Israel pivoting to Russia, that that really Israel wants to be on the side of Putin, and even the Abraham Accords, like it's not necessarily about spreading democracy or anything like that. It's about strength and
Oh,
nationalism,
peace. Yeah.
and in saying that self-determination, that Israel's a Jewish nation and they have the right to but not necessarily like democracy and minority rights.
No,
And
it's
to
not.
say
It's about peace. But David, I don't think that I do Hezbollah talking points, whatever you call them,
Hasbora, yeah.
Hezbollah talking points. I mean, I arrive at it based upon, I think, a fairly good study of all sides. And, I certainly, I don't think I speak for the Israeli government or the Israeli position. And, but, I am pro-Israel for sure, but I come at it from my own angle. I think that as far as Russia, I mean, if any nation is going to present their own case, Russia and their own causal, their own positive case for war and their own case against the enemy, just like any politician, when you run for office, you present your case positively. This is what I stand for. This is what I believe. And then you attack your opponent and say, this is what the other guy, he doesn't want to do this. That's just a basic given. I mean, that's a basic model. Now, as far as Russia goes, I mean, yeah, I mean, I know what you mean. I don't know if you saw my show from the other day with that left-wing professor from the University of Pittsburgh, Daniel Kovanik, but he was saying, oh, well, Ukraine has neo-Nazis. And, I mean, I've heard this too. I mean, I don't think it's quite that simple. After all, Zelenko is a Jew. I mean, how much of a Nazi could he be? But he does make the point, and I would even add
I
to it.
mean, the militias,
Sure,
saying that even to say, okay, like they're neo-Nazis, therefore they're anti-Semitic. Well, no, I mean, because they're neo-Nazis in the sense, well, Israel has been training and giving weapons to them, and even like a transfer agreement type thing
Mhm.
where Israel to some extent wants, I mean, the largest influx of immigrants to Israel has been coming to the Ukraine. And there's actually like an active interest in Israel to get tens of, to have a complete exodus of
Right.
Ukrainian Jews there. So it'd be some sort of like transfer agreement where, like, God forbid, some unholy alliance where Israel is actually teaming up with neo-Nazis and does want the
Well,
max
sure.
mass exodus,
Israel's entire raison
but
d'etre
it's minor. It's the
you know, I
role of
mean,
the
look,
neo-Nazis
Israel
is
made
relatively minor in
Israel
terms of
made
the
tried to
arms
make deals with
dealing
the
and
real
the
Nazis in the 1930s, right? They had an emissary trying to negotiate with Hitler to get Jews released to Palestine. So that's Israel will talk to any nation, Nazi, communist, in order to help the Jews get to safety and get to the state of Israel. That's Israel's
but
raison
it's a
d'etre.
complaint against Netanyahu and the military regime going back years and like things with um various people like in Hungary or other countries that the working with Ukraine and even training and arming and you're
Right.
saying like doesn't make sense like from some respect that to the American mind it doesn't make sense that you have like Israeli training neo-Nazis and arming them but to
But it
some
makes
extent,
sense from an Israeli mind because they're trying to get Jews, as you say, it's a trade. Look, Israel did have a transfer agreement with Hitler,
well,
right?
even historically also that these are
That's not a
people,
big, I don't see anything wrong with that. They
I
were
mean,
trying
these
to
are
rescue
people that are
Jews.
descended from a lot of these people. They're not just like alt-righters in America. These are literally the descendants of Nazis that persecuted
Sure.
Jews and fought on behalf of Germany,
No, there
World
is.
War
That's right.
II,
That's right.
and saying that Russia, so I mean, Putin, saying that like it is somewhat like been saying like Zelenko in the but of that region, and then it's the framing type thing. Like I said that I say like okay, like we went into World War II to save the Jews, like that's the way we want to frame it. And you might like as a Jew or someone else
I don't think that's why we went
argue
into
with
it.
the
And if
framing.
we did,
I
we
mean,
did a lot of
Putin
the
has been
German.
doing that for decades. Also, that Putin
Yeah, but
said that
David, the issue is much bigger than that. I mean, I don't think Putin and I don't think Russia cares if there's a couple of neo-Nazi militias in the Ukraine. I think the issue really has more to do with
which
the
is the framing that
European.
they're the good guys.
No, it has more to do
I mean,
with
Putin's trying to frame it that they're the good
yeah,
guys.
that's just propaganda. I get that. But the real issue that Russia's concerned about is the European Union and NATO formally going in and taking Ukraine in as part of their edifice, and they are trying to do that. And that's something that Russia has a legitimate concern about. In other words, I mean, if the idea of Ukraine, which is really,
And Ukraine's a failed state. I mean, basically, like
I agree, but the
the
point is that
economy.
Ukraine is
That
really,
if you're a Russian or even a Jew, like the poorest Jews in the world are basically Ukrainian Jews, God forbid,
and also
and it's like
Ukraine
six
really
thousand dollars a year
historically,
GDP that you say to liberate the Ukrainian people from whatever from the failed state that it is.
yeah, but Ukraine historically and even more recently is part of Russia. I mean, there's very little difference between the two. And the fact is that by Ukraine allying itself with NATO and forming a military agreement with NATO, that would be like Mexico forming a military pact with China and Chinese troops moving into the US Mexican border. That's not tolerable. I mean, this is,
Well, I mean, just the
Ukraine, even though
Ukraine-Russian alignment is more natural than a Ukraine-European alignment.
I agree. And the point is that I think Ukraine has a right to sovereignty, but it is in the general sphere of influence for Russia. And to try to rip that away and turn it into the enemies of Russia, that is a legitimate question for Russia to grapple with. I don't think it's not just Putin either. I mean, if Navalny, who's in prison, if he was premier, he would probably have the same attitude. You can't have Ukraine right in the heart of Russia forming a military alliance with Russia's potential enemies. It's like, look, it's a natural, as you say, it's a natural thing. The United States in the 1820s issued the Monroe Doctrine, written by John Quincy Adams, which basically said that the Western Hemisphere is America's sphere of influence, and that foreign enemies like Britain and France at the time, they were the big superpowers. They can't come in and start to grab colonies and dominate countries. And if they do, the United States will consider that to be a threat to the United States, and we will go in and stop it. And that doctrine stood up right up until the 1960, when Fidel Castro took over Cuba, and that was a satellite of the Soviet Union. But the point is that for the same reason, the Ukraine, Central Asia to a certain extent, even the Baltics, these are within the Russian sphere. That doesn't mean that Finland, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be sovereign. They should, but they can't be forming. It would be like if the West Bank formed a formal alliance with Iran and started to let Iranian troops come in. If it was an independent Palestinian state, that would not be tolerable for Israel for obvious reasons. There are certain regional understandings in terms of geopolitical conditions. You can't just have the Ukraine. And I think what happened was when the Ukraine had their coup d'etat in 2014, and they overthrew the elected government of Yanukovych, who, people, he was horrible, he was corrupt, fine. The point is he was elected, and he was elected by a majority of people there. He was the legitimate head of state, and he leaned toward Russia. When he was overthrown, this new coup regime was trying to very rapidly move into the European Union, and they say that the Europeans and NATO was behind that coup. And so that's why Russia responded by shoring up its position in the Crimea and asserting its position on the eastern part of the border where you had the Donetsk region. And that's what it's all about. I mean, Ukraine, it's provocative to Russia, and they are threatening to join NATO. And I actually agree with Russia on this. Do we want Ukraine in NATO? I mean, if Ukraine was in NATO, that would mean that Americans would have to go there and fight. Because
there's really a lot of parallels to Israel-Palestine. You're saying, like, okay, the two-state solution wouldn't work because Palestine would be a failed state, and the only way that Palestine would be able to sustain itself would be through alliance with like Iran, and then they would use that to wage war against Israel.
That's right.
And that's kind of what Russia
Well, it could
said.
work.
Ukraine is a failed state, and the only way that Ukraine could sustain itself is with aligning itself with NATO. That's just going to use.
No, the thing is, it could work
war against Russia.
No, it wouldn't have to. It could be not a failed state if it allied itself with Russia, in the same way that a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria could be the only hope that it could be a viable political entity is if it allied itself with Israel.
There's actually more similarities between Ukrainians and Russians than with Israelis and Palestinians. And
I understand that, but I'm just
the invasion released a statement about not recognizing the Golan Heights, and it's kind of people make the complaint, how come all the attention against Israel? And I don't know what you'd answer the Russian propaganda saying, look, what Russia's doing is less than what Israel's doing. What's with all the sanctions against Russia when they're not sanctioning Israel, when relatively militarily compared to like the annexation of the
difference is that the Palestinians
less than Israel has done.
No, the difference is that Ukraine isn't trying to destroy Russia, whereas the Palestinian leadership would like to wipe out Israel.
Well, so you're claiming. So I mean, the opponents would say that really the Palestinians, the Arabs, or Hezbollah or Lebanon. But that's what.
No, I'm saying
the exact same thing you said. Putin said, "Is there genocidal, crazy people trying to genocide the Russians?"
Well, he's wrong. I don't think that Ukraine does. Ukraine have any
the exact same language that you use?
Well, because it's true. Israel. Well, they're two different conflicts.
You said it was true when Putin.
No, it is true in Israel. It's not true in Russia. Look at these are two different conflicts that have nothing to do with each other. Ukraine has no designs on conquering Moscow and wiping out Russia. They simply want to be independent and sovereign.
I mean, NATO does.
Yeah, well, NATO. That's why Ukraine shouldn't align himself with NATO. NATO is trying to move in on the eastern part of Europe.
I'm saying that you reject that. I mean, by saying that the Russian propaganda is basically the exact same talking points you gave about Israel. They're just defending themselves against genocidal maniacs.
No, look at it's. I suppose that it is in terms of Ukraine, if they allied themselves with NATO and they enter into a military pact with NATO, then
Well,
Russia
just like
would,
Iran, if you
yeah,
looked at like Iran and Hezbollah building military installments right on their border,
that's
that's what
right.
NATO doing.
I
They're
guess,
building
David,
military installments right on
in that
Russia's
sense,
border.
you're right. That is exactly what I'm saying.
I mean, that's exactly
If,
what Putin said. He's just
and
defending
he's
himself
right
against
about that.
genocidal
He's not
maniacs.
defending himself, but he's
That
right.
is what he said.
Fine. He's right
I'm
if
not defending. I'm just reporting that.
I understand. And he
I
does make the case if, in fact, Ukraine is aligning themselves militarily and entering into a pact with with NATO, that is a concern for Russia. Doesn't mean that they're going to invade Russia, but it does put enemy troops right within striking distance of Russia. In the same way that if China signed a pact with Mexico, it would put Chinese troops on the American border. That is a concern. And yeah, that is comparable to Israel if a Palestinian state formed an alliance with Iran and Iran started to put troops into the West Bank. That would
Israel
pose a
dropping
threat to
bombs in
Israel.
Syria like every week.
Who is?
Israel bombing.
Yeah, because because Iran has the
weapons
proxy.
deliveries.
Iran has Iran has something like 80,000
NATO weapons
missiles.
deliveries.
Iran has
that Israel has the right
80,000 missiles are facing Israel from southern Lebanon and Syria. So yeah, Israel is
that's
defending
exactly what
itself from
NATO
that.
wants to do
That's
in
right.
Ukraine.
And that's why Russia has a case. NATO should not be forming alliance with Ukraine. Ukraine is acting provocatively by doing that. They're right. It is similar. I think that do we really want to see an alliance between a military alliance backing Ukraine? We'll be fighting a war with Russia. That's the last thing we need, nuclear war. So no, I think that Russia does make a case that while they would have respected Ukrainian sovereignty if Ukraine did not align itself militarily with its enemies. And the same thing I think could apply to the Palestinian Arabs. They could probably have some kind of an autonomy. Maybe
That's
even
unclear. I mean, say if Ukraine was a failed state, and the only way that Ukraine could, maintain not being a failed state was either to.
I don't think that's true.
It was either to align with Russia or with NATO. That was really their only choices.
Well, then they should have taken the choice of aligning with Russia because Russia, they're in the sphere of influence within Russia, whether they like it or not. Same thing with the Palestinian state on the West Bank. They would have really no choice but to align themselves with Israel rather than with Israel's enemies. It just makes sense from in so many different levels. And yeah, that is similar. And I think that, I mean, do you think it would be appropriate, let's just say theoretically, if the Palestinian Arabs did achieve sovereignty in Samaria and Judea, they did have a state. Do you think it would be appropriate for that state to form a military alliance with Iran and start to let Iran set up missiles right outside of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem? I mean, would that be a smart idea?
That's why no one considers a two-state solution in Israel. And
right.
I mean,
well, the point is
that even without a state, they're doing that.
Well, not in the West Bank. But the point, the point is that
I mean, most of those rockets. I mean, rockets are homemade, but it's like no, most of the Gaza's military equipment.
Well, that's why there
Iran.
can't be a Palestinian state.
I mean,
but
even with Israel's bombing and everything Israel does, that still most of the Hamas's military equipment does come from Iran.
It does, and that's why there can't be a Palestinian state. Now, if there were to be a Palestinian state, it would have to be, in order for there to be any hope that it wouldn't be either a failed state or a launching pad for a war against Israel, which is like what Gaza is, it would have to be a militarily neutralized state. They could have a local police organization. They could basically police their own people, but they would not be able to have a full army. They would not be able to have full foreign policy where they could enter into alliances with Israel's enemies. It would have to be, working within Israel kind of as a junior partner. That's the only way it would work. And I think that probably the same thing to an extent was true about Ukraine. Ukraine can have sovereignty. They can develop probably a prosperous state. They have resources. They could have investment. They could do everything, but they cannot function outside of Russia's complete sphere. They can't form alliances with Russia's enemies. let me give you another example of how this
I
has
think
worked.
Ukraine is economically worse than Palestine. Like, I think like GDP, literally
But they
economically,
could
that
become more.
Ukrainians are in a worse economic situation than maybe
But
not than
if they
Gaza,
wanted to,
but
they
then
could
the West
become
Bank.
better. It's the breadbasket of Europe. The Finland, right, is a sovereign nation on Russia's borders. But you might have heard of the Finlandization policies from the
I
period
mean,
of
Finland and Russia fought wars.
before World War II, they did. But after World War II, and Finland was very closely allied with Hitler. But after World War II, you had an alliance between Russia and Finland. Russia could wipe out Finland in 2 seconds if they wanted to, but they didn't because Finland kind of fell into the Russian realm. They didn't provoke Russia. They didn't form alliances. They're not in NATO. They did not, engage in provocative activities. They recognized that they were in the Russian sphere and they had this behemoth on their border. So they basically played ball with Russia and they were able to develop a very prosperous and independent society, one of the most prosperous in the world, in terms of like startups and innovation and economic success. But they don't have a military that's going to, they're kind of neutral and they don't get involved. They didn't get involved in the Cold War on either side. And they maintained a certain, kind of not appeasement, but a degree of understanding with Russia. And that's why it worked for them. I think the same thing could be said for Ukraine. It could be said for a potential Palestinian state, but they have to recognize the reality of where they are. I mean, they're in, they have a neighbor that they have to be peaceful with. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
Yeah, I mean that's history. Could have, should have, would have. At
Well, it
this
could be
point,
in the future.
at this point, really, all they could do is
Well,
surrender.
at this point, it's too late. Yeah. I mean, I'm just
And
saying,
say the
because they
likelihood that
chose to be provocative. I'm not
we're saying the
blaming
likelihood
Ukraine.
that
I
they're going to
support
surrender.
Ukrainian independence, but
You agree the likely that they're going to
oh
surrender.
yeah, and I hope they do soon
I
because
don't think it's going to be like Bosnia, Serbia. I mean, God forbid, it'd be
No, I hope
millions of
not.
people could die
Yeah,
in
I
a
hope not.
protracted war. That likely they're going to
Oh
surrender.
no, I think they will very quickly, especially if it's true that Russia has taken over the airport, because that means they control the skies and they've got the things surrounded. And it's quite clear that Europe is not going to come in and get involved militarily to help them. No one is. So
It'd be
yeah, I
interesting
think
too,
they
as
will.
Republican politics to say, okay, that I know the president of Pakistan, the former soccer player, was there in Russia meeting with Putin. Likely that Iran and Assad would be, the first people to recognize Russia's control of Ukraine. Would Republican U.S. 2022 candidates run on, if they get elected, that they will recognize Russia's control
No,
of Ukraine?
no, they won't.
And
And
even
I
say,
don't
like,
think,
not to say like the Trump, they say, oh, if Trump was in office, Putin wouldn't have done this. It's like, no, if Trump was still in office, he would have recognized Putin's right to do this. And it's
no,
unclear
well,
that he
no, I
would have,
don't think so. I don't
but
think so.
will Trump
We
back
can't know that,
Putin,
of it,
and
and
will
I don't think.
Republicans start? Well, I'm saying there already are some of them,
Yeah,
and like at least will that be a strategy, and will it work that the
no,
people
I
who
don't
run
think
in
that.
the
I don't
U.S.
think
are
American
recognizing
politicians.
Putin's control of
No, I
Ukraine?
don't think so. I don't think Americans are going to recognize Putin's control of Ukraine. I think that, and
Not
I
the
don't
Biden
think,
administration won't, but I'm saying, will Republican
no, they won't.
candidates run
No,
on
I don't
that?
think anybody will. Who?
Why not? I mean, so why not?
Because there has to be a legitimate independent government in Ukraine. And I think what happens is that
Well,
Putin,
it's annexation, the same way that
I don't
Trump
think it's going to
recognized the
annex
annexation of the
Ukraine.
Golan Heights,
No, I don't think
moving
that,
the
do you think
embassy
that
to
Russia's going to,
Jerusalem. It's going to be the same thing
no,
where people are
I
going to
don't honestly,
recognize the
we
annexation
don't,
of
you and
the
I don't know
Ukraine.
what's going to happen. I don't think Russia's going to outright annex Ukraine. I just don't see that.
Or I'm saying parts of it. But I'm
Maybe,
saying that,
maybe they might slice
it'll
off
be
a
like
few pieces.
Israel, the recognition of the annexation, and then in
Yeah.
U.S. politics,
I
obviously.
don't think that the US is even going to recognize those annexations. I don't think we're going to recognize, for example, that Russia basically
I mean, Biden definitely won't, but I'm saying that
I know, I
Republican
don't think the
candidates
Republicans will.
will run
No,
on
I
that.
don't. No, they will not. Nobody's recognizing that did Trump recognize Russia's annexation of Crimea? No, no one's going to recognize any of this stuff.
Well,
But the point is, it's going to
officially,
happen.
but he didn't stop it.
Neither did Obama. The point is that because they can't. But the point is that what I think is going to happen, we don't know what's going to happen, is that Russia will probably create these independent, semi-autonomous entities on the border of Ukraine, where you have a dominant Russian population, like Luhansk and Donetsk and Crimea. And he might even carve a corridor between Russia and Crimea. But I think at
If
the end of
install
the
a pro-Russian president like the last one that got deposed.
That's right. At the end of the day, they're going to have a government that will be pro-Russian, and they will have a more pro-Russian president. Yes, I do think that'll happen. And I think that that government will probably be recognized by the world, not just the United States.
You think Zelensky, God forbid, gets killed, or he
No, I don't think he's going
or
to.
he goes into exile.
I think that he'll probably either go into exile or he'll just, look at Hamid Karzai, who was the president of Afghanistan.
So what happens if, I mean, just
He
scenarios.
didn't go into
if people
exile. He's
start
still there in
surrendering
trouble.
And he keeps on talking tough and saying like, we're going to fight.
Well, I
we're
think
gonna
he might.
fight,"
I think he might
and then,
back down.
and then the Ukrainians don't have the. I mean, they've declared martial law. If large portions of Ukrainians want to start surrendering, or Ukrainian troops start surrendering, and if Zelensky tries to force them to fight, it might cost him his life.
It might,
or
but I don't think and hopefully that doesn't happen.
Or
I-
what? How does Ukraine lose this? How
Well,
like, if
does
Russia can't
Ukraine
win
really
this
want to
war,
have a war with
guaranteed-
Russia? Because they'll probably lose
Yeah,
it.
but
I
how do
hope
they go about losing it? At what point
They
does
have
the
to.
Ukrainian army
They'll have to surrender.
surrender? What happens to Zelensky?
Hopefully
Like,
soon. Hopefully soon. The
I mean,
point is,
Zelensky
and
gets
I
on
think that
TV and says he surrenders.
no,
or
he
just
doesn't.
appears
No,
like he's in America, and you see him in a press conference with Biden, or becomes like
No, I
the
don't think
Shah
so.
of Iran living in
No, I don't
California.
think so. I mean, we don't know, David. You and I can't know. What I think
The scenario, how does it end?
I'll tell you how it
How
ends.
does
I think
Ukraine surrender?
I think it's going to end like the way Hamid Karzai lives in Kabul. He was the president of Afghanistan before the takeover by the Taliban, and he's still there. He didn't go into exile. But he kind of keeps quiet. He lives there with his family, and he hopes for the best. And I think that that's probably what's going to happen with Zelenko. He'll stay in Kiev.
Zelensky,
Zelensky.
Dr. Zelenko.
He'll stay in Kiev with his family, but he's not going to be all that involved in politics. He'll probably retire, just like who was the first leader of Russia? You know who I mean. He was right after Gorbachev, the president. I'm having like a senior moment here. Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin. They gave him a nice villa and he retired, right? That's what I think is going to happen to Zelenko. And I think that the new president there is going to be more pro-Russian, and that president and that government will be recognized by the world. It's just that simple, because there's no other choice. Russia is not going to have in Ukraine a hostile government that's going to ally itself militarily with its enemies. And that to me is reasonable. We're sorry it had to come to a war. And I don't think I don't think it's good that they're invading the country. But
God forbid, I mean, the death toll's been, I mean, still, like a few hundred people might have already died, but the death toll's been relatively minor.
right.
Saying if there is a quick surrender, there could be under 1,000 dead. But if they
Right.
fight
I
it
think
out,
that's what
it'd be like Bosnia, Serbia, it'd be millions.
Exactly. And I don't think that's going to happen in Ukraine, because but first of all, I don't think Ukraine.
I think Putin's counting on kind of winning with really a death toll in the hundreds.
Exactly. And that's hopefully how it will go. Let's hope that there is a minimal amount of death. I don't think Ukraine really can fight a war with Russia.
God forbid, in Czechoslovakia.
Well, in the case of Czechoslovakia, there was virtually no deaths. I mean, because the West basically handed it over to Hitler on a silver platter. But look, the point is that we hope that in the case of Ukraine, it is a quick solution. Ukraine is not going to be able to fight, I don't think, Russia at this point. It's just, you just look at anybody who even takes an examination of the topography. Russia has this 1,000-mile border. They're surrounded on all sides, and it's a flat country. There's not even, I mean, at least in Bosnia, they had mountains. You could do like a resistance and you could do a guerrilla. I don't think that Ukraine is set up for that. I don't think the Ukrainian people are set up for that. Who knows? But I don't think so.
I understand they've kind of already won. They are basically already on the outskirts. They've taken over the
Yeah,
major military sites and they're on the outskirts of the major cities.
that's right. And I just don't think that there's a will in Ukraine to fight, which is all the more reason why we can say that it would have been a disaster for the West to have brought Ukraine into NATO, because if they're not going to fight for their own country, do we want to send Americans in there to get killed? I mean, that would have been horrendous. And plus, not to mention the
It's really
nuclear.
kind of like Biden in Afghanistan, like they like, blaming the fake Afghanistan army for not fighting hard enough.
No, I don't blame them.
Like blaming the
They didn't
fake
have the will
Ukrainian
to
army
fight.
for not fighting hard enough.
No, I don't blame them.
Is Biden going to blame the fake Ukrainian army for not fighting hard enough?
He probably will, and that's wrong. Look, I don't blame the Afghanistan army for not fighting either. I think that the methodology of withdrawal for the United States was horrible. It could have been done a little bit more coordinated, and we could have got our people out. We could have gotten the $750 billion worth of military hardware out before leaving, instead of giving that over to China. And we probably could have stayed at Bagram Air Base without any problem. That is not.
So let's talk the outcome for the U.S. and then Israel. So I mean, that's if Putin's successful and in like in a week it's over, and it appears that he did it, and all the U.S. talk. What did Biden and the Democrats? They just continue their rhetoric, even though
Their policy was disastrous.
They failed into the election.
They did fail. They did fail.
Bad, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter.
No, it does matter.
Continue with their projects, and it's just see that.
No, it's disastrous for the Democrats.
America's weak on the international scene, and we have no power.
We look very weak, and it's a disaster for Biden. It didn't have to go this way. It is true, I think, and we can't know. But had Trump been in office, this wouldn't have happened, because Trump, besides the fact that Trump
brokered a deal. I said just.
Well, that's the point. Trump exuded.
They could have brokered a deal.
They could have, and the point is that Trump exuded strength and legitimacy, whereas Biden exudes weakness and illegitimacy. Everyone in Europe knows that this regime of Biden's is not legitimate. We don't hear about.
Fly to Europe and have an emergency meeting with Zelensky.
Well, the thing is that I think, and also Biden is very
right now.
His family
there
is
should be a
very
meeting with
corrupted.
Zelensky and Putin. I mean, there's no way that's going to happen. But saying like if Trump was really a
Whatever.
leader,
The point is that
it'd be like Stalin, FDR, and
maybe,
Churchill or something.
the
But
point
by
is
saying
that with Trump, he basically, while he operated from a position of strength, he also wanted to have productive relationship with Russia, which was good. I don't know why that was so criticized. Oh, he's spying for Russia. No, he wanted to have a business-like relationship with Russia. He wanted Russia to be America's ally. It should be our ally. It's
Biden was pro-Ukraine and Trump was pro.
Biden, on the other hand, was basically insulting Putin and calling him a murderer, and he was, this old demented guy, screaming at him, and he couldn't really back it up, and it was very counterproductive. It basically it didn't work well for moving toward a bad result. I think if it had been Trump, first of all, Trump was against the idea of Ukraine joining NATO, and the United States has veto power on that. And I think that
it goes back to what I just said. Why aren't the Republicans going to run on a pro-Putin platform?
It's not pro-Putin. Nobody's pro-Putin. It's simply that it's a good idea to have a constructive and business relationship with Russia, and not, it's not because it's not a matter
run on ending the sanctions. I mean, Biden's going to put the sanctions, or Republicans.
No, the sanctions aren't. That doesn't mean anything.
If they win,
Russia doesn't care.
Are they going to oppose the sanctions?
No, Russia doesn't care about it anyways, because apparently Russia, they've already maxed out on the sanctions a long time ago. And by the way, Trump kept the sanctions. That doesn't matter. The point is that he wanted to have a positive relationship with Russia based on American strength. Whereas in the case of Biden, it's a weak stand because the regime is not seen as legitimate, and he's not a legitimate person. And secondly, it's a bellicose position. It's a warlike, position against Russia, which is not necessary. Russia is a huge power, whether we like them or not. And it would have been actually a good alliance for the United States, especially with the rise of China, rather than have what you're having now, which is China and Russia forming a land empire that stretches all the way. It's sort of like a military disaster. And not to mention the fact that Iran and Turkey and other countries that are not
Yeah, I mean, it's just what's going to happen with Israel. But yeah, I mean, it's likely going to
very
be
bad.
a China, Syria, Iran, possibly Turkey, Russia, alliance.
Very bad, very bad news. And it's all because of the weak and illegitimate regime in Washington. Nobody respects them. Everyone knows they're not going to do anything. The disaster in Afghanistan, now the disaster in Ukraine. Who's next? China is now flying
But
military
America
planes
first,
over
America national.
Taiwan.
You said that's good. Get rid of the global. You say, okay, America isn't a global power anymore, and we just got to focus on being America, and get the fantasy out of our head of any of these global things, and that
No, I
Trump
think that, look,
still had
Trump.
these global fantasies.
No, he didn't, though. Trump wanted to have peace with the world. He wanted to withdraw American troops from much of the world. He wanted the European Union and NATO to pay their own way for their own military. He wanted the United States to be strong, but his policy basically was a modernization of Reagan's policy of peace through strength, and to make sure that we had the ability militarily to fight a war on two fronts on both borders and maintain positive relationships with our allies, but not be interventionists, not be involved in this policy that's been in place since World War I, which was described by historian Harry Elmer Barnes in his book called Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace. That's been the American policy since World War I, and it hasn't worked, and it's over. And in a way, Ukraine is the final nail in that coffin. We are no longer going to be involved in these perpetual wars and nation building around the world. But that doesn't mean that we're in decline. We have to strengthen the home front and, strengthen alliances in other ways with nations in the world. We don't have
Well,
to
I
be
mean, because
involved.
some of it means, I mean, for decades, the Cold War, we fought in Afghanistan and the Middle East largely to limit Russian power. And here will be, the example that the U.S. just doesn't have the power to limit
Well, it was different, though,
Russian growth.
David.
We pulled out of Afghanistan. The red line in Syria, Assad is still there, and here in Ukraine, or if there's a crumbling of NATO, so okay, we're
Well,
safe
first of all, we
largely
had the
in
policy of
America, but
containment that was really started in 1948 by George Kennan. And that was to sort of contain, it wasn't Russia per se, it was communism. Russia was the footprint, was kind of the footstool for an international movement that sought to subdue the entire planet. It was very much like the radical Islamic view. And it was aggressive. I mean, it wasn't just Russia, Cuba, China, Vietnam, Africa. They were engaging in an aggressive policy all over the world. But I think that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, I don't think Russia has those same kind of designs. I think Russia wants to operate in its own sphere of influence and maintain generally a peaceful relationship with the United States and Europe. I don't think that
likely.
they're no longer trying to subvert. There's no longer. I mean, Russia before, in the height of the Cold War, they had communist parties which were appendages of the Russian Politburo trying to subvert nations around the world. They're not doing that now. I don't think it's a matter of change. Russia has changed. Some people, some real conspiracy theorists, like maybe some people in the John Birch Society, they think that Russia's still doing this. They think that there was this Russian spy Golitsyn who he defected to the United States in the 70s, who wrote a book called New Lies for Old, which he basically said, well, Russia's going to say they're no longer communist and they're no longer the Soviet Union, but they're still going to be doing it. And they're still, I don't think so. I don't think there's evidence of that. I think that Russia is a nationalist country. Putin is a nationalist. He's not an internationalist. And I think that, and Trump was as well. And I think that's why they understood each other. Whereas Biden and the old regime, they're still internationalists. And that whole internationalist New World Order idea is taking a major hit right now. And I think it's crumbling. And I hope it does.
Yeah, I mean, it could be, this is going to be from the final
Anyway,
round.
David, but
One last,
we should wrap it up.
wait,
Well,
wait,
go
from the
ahead.
Israeli perspective, like,
Yeah.
is it, so Lapid has spoken out against Putin. Bennett has tried to be neutral, so there could be a mass exodus. It's possible of, questionable tens of thousands of Jews will leave Ukraine to Israel.
Good.
Could there be a political shakeup, like a return of Netanyahu, who relatively probably
I
has
don't
the
think
best,
Netanyahu's ever going to come back, but I'm glad to
but
see the
because he had
Jews
good
go.
relations with Putin, that I don't know, Israel not necessarily weakened, but if there is, in terms of the Iran, like the Iran deal, that Israel will have less leverage with the U.S. weakened like that, and that Israel will have to deal with this Russian, Iranian, Syrian um, alliance, and
Well,
saying Israel
they've had to
could
deal
be
with it
strengthened
since.
in some way, that the Abraham Accords, and there's more and
Mhm.
more nations, but at the same time that Israel is likely going to have to deal with the strength, with a more legitimized Iran, and then even like the ability of Israel to operate in Syria, with U.S. support, that Russia will hold more cards. So it'd be interesting, and if there'd be a shakeup,
Yeah, but
if
Israel has a
Lapid,
pretty solid relationship with
or
Russia
just finish,
too.
if Lapid choosing the wrong side, speaking too much against Putin,
I
and
don't
then
think
if
they are,
Ukraine
and
does
I don't think they
surrender,
should.
if somehow that ruins his, it's coming up in months now that he would switch to being prime minister, that there might be some sort of new coalition with the right, that Lapid would have messed it up, and because he's not good with Putin, there would be some sort of new pro-Putin coalition that would exclude
No, I
Lapid
think that
from.
all sides in Russia, in Israel, want to have a cordial relationship with Russia. That goes way back. It goes back to Ben Gurion. I mean, Israel has
So he'll
cultivated.
be able to retract his statement. So if
Yeah,
Ukraine,
I think that's
if
just.
Putin basically wins, Lapid will be able to retract his statements and visit Moscow, and just be
Yes,
like,
I
okay,
do.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think so. And I don't think Israel's come out that strongly against Putin. Every country in the world is coming out against Putin right now. That's just posturing. I
I
don't
mean,
think
Lapid,
Israel.
Lapid condemned the attack. I mean, Bennett didn't
So
even
did every
condemn.
country in the world,
No, I mean,
except
Bennett
maybe.
did not even condemn Putin's invasion.
Oh, well, there
So I
you
mean,
go.
Lapid condemned the invasion. Bennett
Fine. I
refrained.
think every country
Bennett
has.
Bennett did not even condemn.
I mean,
I mean,
look, I
he
think
said that
probably
they
the.
pray and they want the best for the Ukrainian people, but Bennett refrained from even condemning
Yeah, but
Putin's
probably the only.
invasion, as
Well,
opposed
that's.
to Lapid openly condemned the invasion.
Okay, well, I mean, just in terms of that, I think probably every country in the world, I can't know this, but probably with maybe the exception of Cuba and North Korea, has condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Well, I said Bennett did not condemn. He
And
did not
Bennett
condemn
didn't
the.
do it, not at all.
Well, I just think that it's probably not in Israel's interest to condemn it. I saying that Lapid did. Bennett, spoke, and that he wishes peace, and he put the best half, and with the strength that he stands with the Ukrainian people, but he did not condemn Putin or the invasion, as opposed to Lapid
I think
condemned it.
that's just a lot of posturing. Israel has had to take
Well,
some
because
rather.
they're probably see that Putin's probably likely to win.
Yeah,
And
and I think
Bennett,
Israel has
and
had to
he
make some
waited, like
moral.
they were demanding a statement. Bennett waited till today to make his statement, and so I mean, you could check the Israeli papers,
No, I believe
but
that. I
Bennett
mean,
Bennett
that's posturing.
did
Look
not
at
condemn.
Israel's had to make some strange moral compromises in the world stage. Like, for example,
They
the
could pivot away
Israelis.
from the U.S. more towards Russia. It could be. I mean, we've talked about that many times, but just the situation that for Israel's national security and the regional difficulty it faced, that Israel would pivot towards Russia as opposed to the US, because it's in their interest.
I think they've always had tried to not pivot
I mean,
outright toward
that's your
Russia,
point.
but
They're saying that Lapid condemning Putin, and Bennett not even condemning
yeah,
it.
but I think that ultimately Lapid and Bennett and all of these people, when they get together quietly in the Knesset or wherever they meet, they do what's in the Israel's best interest, and sometimes that can mean a moral compromise. Like, for example, the Israelis have never condemned Turkey for the Armenian genocide, and because they want to have a good relationship with Turkey. It's not a good thing, it's not moral that they won't do it, but they won't because Turkey is a powerful country than Armenia. It's just that simple. It's a maybe it's realpolitik, but ultimately, at the end of the day, Israel's going to have to, will operate in the interests of Israel and
I mean,
preserving
Israel is
Israel's position.
unlikely to do the sanction. I mean, if it's, I mean, even the U.S. that the U.S. would care, but if the
Well, the
sanctions are
sanctions aren't
very,
going to happen anyways. I don't know if you saw the news today. I just before coming on with you, that that first of all, the sanctions are already tapped out, and Biden made some noise about banking sanctions and investment sanctions. Well, I mean, right now in Russia, the ruble and the Russian equivalent of Wall Street is soaring, so it doesn't matter. Russia is very self-sufficient. They don't care about sanctions. It's just these are all this is all just pro forma, kind of like positioning is what I understand. Anyway, David, what do you have coming up on your show?
so I ended up, on Rouse. I was on a debate with these Muslim extremist Muslims in London. I had a chess um, master on my channel this week. This guy, Robert from Canada, who's like a Canadian convert to Islam. He was on Ed Dutton today talking about, how he thinks Islam will save Europe and Europeans converting to Islam. I
Maybe
might
that like the Pope
have
is
on my
Muslim.
channel. He would probably enjoy speaking to you. So that's possible that will
All right,
be
I'll talk
this
to him.
week. I just mention real quick, my grandfather was a stamp collector, and
Mhm.
and I have his stamps, and he's got those Nazi stamps where you could see, like in the 30s, and you could see that like the numbers go up into the millions, the price, like because the rapid inflation,
Right.
and God forbid, um, be prepared that something like that. I don't know if that case like this thing just if you,
No, but it's
you
very
know what I'm
bad right
talking
now.
about. I mean, you've heard about, but to actually have those stamps, and you could see the numbers going from like 10 whatever the Deutschmark for a stamp to like 10 billion for one stamp.
Yeah.
That I would be worried that something like that could happen here in America. So how exactly, like we said at the beginning, stocking up, looking into solar or generator, like pivoting to eBay business or various things. But yeah, and so I we got to keep, obviously, we talk partners in Torah. We're going to talk about Israel every week, and Russia, Ukraine. We'll see what happens with that. But I think, God forbid, we could see some austerities, inflations,
Oh, yeah,
a lot
it's
of
already
problems
happening. It's already
facing
happening.
us.
The pricing of rents are flying through the roof. Gas prices are flying through the roof. It's already happening. Anyway, David, we'll talk next week. Thanks a lot.
Yes, Shabbat Shalom.
Okay, Shabbat Shalom.